Good morning, ladies and gents. Thank you for having me. It's a wonderful day, and it's a strange feeling to not be presenting in front of a crowd. But even though you're not right in front of me, I know you all are there, and it's wonderful to be here. Today, I'm going to give you some feedback about the SAMAC loss factor benchmark, and specifically Mac economics, and to calculate the losses in the macadamia industry, with a specific focus on the 2019 season. And going forward, and we'll obviously use the historic information to put that all into context. So just a little bit of background. This project has been funded by SAMAC for the last 7 years. And what we've been doing is we've been collecting the macadamia loss factors through the participating handlers, and are compiled and measured by Source BI Pty Limited every year. Each grower member of SAMAC receives an online interactive Power BI model report, and then that producer can compare himself to the industry on the variables that's relevant to him by looking at production areas, cultivars, or cultivar groupings at least, and also seasonality. This Power BI report, as we've been moving away completely from PDF documents, and we want the information to become something that's interactive, that's alive, and that you can communicate with and get information relevant to you yourself. So just a word of thank you to all of the participating handlers that's been giving us this great information for the last couple of years, and specifically in the 2019 season. Golden Macadamias, Green Farms Nut Company, Kavuka Nuts, Macridge, Mayo Max, Mooncloud 13, Royal Macadamias, SA Mac Pro, SAMAC, and also ZMAC up in Lavubu. All the data that we've gathered represents almost 80%. It's more realistically like 77% of the 2019 crop. So it's very representative, and we can extrapolate this to represent the whole of the South African macadamia industry. So let's get into some of the detail. I just want to give you some background on what we're going to be talking about. The benchmark handles about the quality issue, and we look specifically at unsound kernel recovery, and that's our main focus. We're going to zoom in on unsound kernel recovery. Next, we're going to have a quick look on sound kernel recovery, and then those two factors combined obviously give us the total kernel recovery. Unsound kernel recovery having a cost implication to growers, sound kernel recovery being the drive force of income on farm, and then total kernel recovery is the combination of the two. Then the focus of this benchmark, and to calculate losses on farm and for the industry as a whole, we want to look at early stink bug, late stink bug, immatures, pre-germination, 791 spot, mold, discoloration, as well as other. We always have an other grouping, and within that's all the smaller unsound kernel recovery elements or factors that gets bundled up together into the other grouping. But as you'll see later, it's not such a big part of the total lot. So in terms of the representation of this benchmark, in 2013, you can see that we started off low at 22,800 tons that we were analyzing from the various participating handlers. And since 2015, it's just started exponentially growing, and where we ended up in 2019 analyzing in depth 45,400 tons out of the 59,000 produced in 2019. So it's really phenomenal, the growth of not only the macadamia industry, but also the representation of this benchmark. A quick overview of the production areas. As you can see on the far right side, you'll see Mpumalanga in the gray, being the biggest producing area of macadamias in South Africa, in this benchmark representing about 38-39% of the total data set, followed by Lavubu way up north in the green, KZN North and KZN South next up, and then we've got a little bit of nuts coming through in the Eastern Cape as well as in the Gauteng and Highveld, but the Gauteng and Highveld is negligible. It's a very small part of the data pool. So given this element, when we talk about averages, we know that the Mpumalanga region is going to be a significant part of the data set, and obviously going to determine where that weighted average goes to a large extent. So just a little bit of background on unsound kernel recovery. We can see over the last 7 years from 2013, the high unsound kernel recoveries that we realized in South Africa, upwards of 4 to even up in 2015 to 4.6% of total kernel recovered, of 4.6% of total dry and shell. But what we saw then is from 2017 season, 2017, 18, and 19 seasons, much lower unsound kernel recovery. In 2017, it was as low as 2.78, 2.8% of dry and shell. But the interesting thing is we can definitely see an upward trend moving from 2017 towards 2018 and 2019, going up to over the 3% mark, going up and up and up, reaching the 7-year average of 3.1% unsound kernel recovery. That is a bit problematic to see that upward trend. So just to put that into the greater context, what we would like to do is look at the total kernel recovery by cultivar. Maybe I can just do one slide back and look at the sound kernel recovery first. Over the 7 years, we can see the same trend that we saw in the unsound kernel recovery, but just in reverse. In 2013, 2014, 15, and 16, we saw lower sound kernel recoveries, and what we've seen in 2017, 18, and 19 is significantly higher sound kernel recoveries. So what we see in 2017 is one of the highest seasons of sound kernel recovery recorded in South Africa at 32.3%. And then it slowly decreased in 2018 and 2019, which is the inverse effect that we can correlate to unsound kernel recovery. So whilst unsound kernel recovery is slowly increasing, sound kernel recovery is slowly coming down. And 2019, we saw it end up at 31.6%, where the 7-year average is it's still higher than the 7-year average of 31.1%. When we look at it on a cultivar or a cultivar grouping basis, it's very evident that the hybrid cultivars have not only the highest sound kernel crackout, but also the highest total kernel crackout, with the sound kernel crackouts of the hybrid cultivars upwards of 33%, with a 3.3% unsound kernel recovery, giving us a 36.3% total kernel recovery. What we see on the intake side is slightly lower than the hybrids, and within the intake cultivar grouping, 31.2% sound kernel recovery, but with a higher level of unsound kernel recovery, having thus a cost implication. And then on the Beaumont, which is one of the bigger cultivars planted in South Africa and represents a big chunk of the data, it's cracking out 31.1% sound kernel with a very low 2.6% unsound kernel. So it's a very low cost implication on the Beaumont cultivar in terms of unsound, but we're only pushing 32% on Beaumont. And then we obviously have the unknown and mixed cultivars. That's always part of the data pool. It doesn't give us good information, but it is part, and we just want to show that as well. Right. If we break it down on a regional level, this is very interesting to see KZN South in the 2019 season, that they cracked out in KZN North and KZN South above 37%. That is phenomenal to see the high crackout figures realized in those Natal areas along the coast, with very low levels of unsound kernel recovery, 2.4% and even less than 2% in southern KZN. Third in line is the Eastern Cape at a 33% crackout with a very, very low unsound kernel recovery, leading to lower total kernel crackouts compared to Mpumalanga. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, as I mentioned, the unsound kernel recovery has a big cost implication to growers. When we look at Mpumalanga, which is the biggest grower region, we see that they closely represent the industry's sound kernel recovery average of 32%. And with a 2.5% unsound kernel recovery. Next in line is Gauteng and Highveld, which is very negligible, but this is the problematic areas. In terms of sound kernel crackout, Levubu and Letaba is in the Tzaneen areas in Limpopo, we see that sound kernel crackout only 25.5%. It's very low. Lavubu staying low, but Letaba dropping by more than 3% compared to the previous seasons. And you can see the big chunk of 5.8% sound kernel recovery, unsound kernel recovery realized in the Letaba region. This is a very, very problematic for us to see because and we can look at that in a little bit more depth, but mostly driven by early and late stink bug in that Letaba region. So it looks like it's from Lavubu, it's starting to come down because Lavubu also struggles with stink bug to a very, very large extent, leading to 5.1% unsound kernel recovery. But Letaba overtaking Lavubu in terms of unsound kernel recovery and having a really, really significant effect on the producers in those grower regions. When we look at the unsound kernel distribution and specifically the loss factors, what we want to see is what makes up the total losses on producer level. And we can immediately see that early and late stink bug in the turquoise and in the gray being more than 50% of total losses realized. This is at the handler level, so it's already delivered at the various factories. And at that stage, we then quantify this. So this does not take into consideration any losses that happened before the nuts get delivered at the factory. So if we quantify using 244 Rand per kilogram kernel or 78 Rand 8 cents for a kilogram nut and shell, and we use that and to calculate the losses relevant to each of those loss factors, you can see that early and late stink bug collectively represent more than 180 million Rand in South Africa, only in this benchmark. If we then extrapolate that to the whole industry of 59,000 tons in 2019, that figure becomes upwards of 220, almost 230 million Rand. Immatures going from 52 million Rand to 65, and mold representing within the benchmark 32 million, but then jumping to 40 million Rand worth in the South African crop. We then see discoloration, other and pre-germination also in there, with 7 on 1 spot being a very, very small portion of the data set. So the 2019 pricing that we used to calculate this economic loss for the mac industry was, first of all, based on a 6% increase in production from the 2018 season, the weaker average Rand compared to the previous season, and as well as high US dollar selling prices, leading to 21% higher prices returns to the growers, and then third, the 3% rise in unsound kernel. So all of those variables led to us getting and realizing 244 Rand per kilogram, or a 78 Rand a kilogram kernel, or the 78 Rand 10 cents per kilogram nut and shell, which we used to calculate the loss due to each of these factors. So because we saw the big effect of early and late stink bug, this is where we want to start analyzing a little bit deeper. So let's go to the last slide and just have a look. Dr. Alsha Ubar yesterday also referred to this slide, and what we want to see here is in the orange, you can see the unsound kernel recovery over the last 7 years coming down in the 2017, 18, and 19 seasons, but there's definitely an upward trend. And you can see stink bug in the 2019 season being a massive part of the 2019 unsound kernel recovery, collectively doing more than 50%, as I mentioned in the previous slide, of total losses. What is relevant here to note is the effect that Lavubu and Letaba has on this average. If you look at the average stink bug damage for the benchmark or the group South African crop, excluding Letaba and Lavubu, it's only 1.1% of dry and shell. But when you look at only those two areas by itself, it's over 3.3%. So you can see where the big stink bug damage areas are in the country, leading to that upward rise in unsound kernel. Right. Thank you very much for your time.